俺が探し続けた男だ。鷹の目のミホーク。
鷹の目のミホーク。
Lonely at the top, suffering from success. There are many characters in One Piece with very little screen time, and thus they've barely been fleshed out as characters. Characters that Oda introduced with major plans for in the future of the story. They carry an air of mystery every time they show up on screen, and fans are guaranteed to be entertained by their appearances. I think the character that fits this best is One Piece's biggest enigma, Monkey D. Dragon. That isn't who we're talking about today though. Today we are talking about who I would call the second biggest enigma in One Piece, former Warlord of the Sea, DRACULE Mihawk. Hiya guys, and welcome to the new series I will be doing on this channel. This series will consist of 7 different videos, one for each of the original Shichibukai, where I will discuss and analyze aspects of their characters. I will be releasing these videos in order of chronological importance, so it's only right for us to start off with the first warlord to be introduced in the story, the world's strongest swordsman, DRACULE Mihawk, who made his debut into the series in chapter 49. Despite being the very first warlord introduced in the story, Mihawk is still the one that we know the least about. In fact, all we know about Mihawk is that he and Shanks used to be rivals and that he was famous before Roger's execution. We don't know anything about his background, where he's from, how he gained the title of the world's strongest swordsman, and so forth. Yet, still, Oda has done a fantastic job at giving Mihawk a layered character and even a subtle character arc in the short time he has been on screen. From the very moment Mihawk appears in the story, it is made vehemently clear that this man is unlike anything we had encountered up until that point. And for nearly 200 chapters after his introduction, there was still nobody who could match this level of presence. Until Whitebeard was introduced, Mihawk was the most intimidating character we had met. That is the sort of statement that was left with us by the strongest swordsman in the world. Speaking of his introduction, there is a lot of intrinsic detail that goes into his introductory page, but before we talk about that, let's talk about the build-up that went into this introduction, because even though that isn't an aspect of his character itself, it makes the introduction itself a million times better. The Baratie arc's main antagonist was Don Krieg. Krieg was a man hyped to hell before his own introduction, built up to be a menacing and cunning individual with a massive fleet of 50 ships. Krieg's most valued subordinate, Gin, advised Luffy not to think about the Grand Line because of his experiences in the terrifying sea. When we finally meet Krieg, he is utterly disappointing and doesn't live up to the hype whatsoever. His ship is in tatters, there is no fleet, he's on the verge of death, he is suffering from starvation, and he is begging for food. The disappointment that comes with Don Krieg's introduction is done purposefully by Oda in order to leave the audience clueless and wondering how a man of his stature could be in a position like this. That is when Gin tells us that Krieg's fleet of 50 ships were completely decimated by a single man. Immediately, Oda has geniusly created massive anticipation for this individual. When the man is described as hawk-eyed, Zoro reacts shockingly. This is the sort of face we rarely see from the stoic swordsman, which adds to the anticipation of this man's introduction and makes for a fantastic cliffhanger ending. In the next chapter, the conversation steers in another direction, taking the focus off of the man until it is abruptly interrupted by a gorgeous double-page spread. The man that was mentioned in the previous chapter makes his grand entrance, and he does so by destroying Don Krieg's massive ship and cutting it clean in half with a single slice. And then we get Zeph reacting to the man's appearance in absolute shock, mirroring the cliffhanger ending of the previous chapter where Zoro looked shocked. Bear in mind, Zeph was described as a legendary pirate who survived the terrifying Grand Line, so for him to react like this does wonders to the audience's anticipation for the shadowy figure's introduction. This level of suspense and tension that was built is something unlike anything we'd seen up until this point in the story. Sure, there were intense moments, but nothing quiet like this. Nothing this exaggerated and built up to. In the following chapter, we finally get to see the man's appearance. The man I'm talking about is obviously Dracule Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman. This introductory panel that you can see right now is actually a lot more layered than one would initially think. From the way he is seated, to his blood-red eyes that make his glare threatening and emphasize his dangerousness, to the amount of crosses on this page and their religious symbolism, a lot of detail was put into the introduction and character design of this man. I could sit here and talk about Mihawk's character design for hours, but you guys don't want to hear me ramble on about that, so let's focus on this. Mihawk's hands are crossed, his legs are crossed, he wears a crucifix around his neck, and his massive black blade looks a lot like a crucifix too. Why has Oda included this much religious imagery in Mihawk's character design? Before we get into answering that, let's talk about Mihawk's animal theme. If you guys didn't know, every single one of the original Shichibukai has an animal theme. Mihawk is associated with hawks. Crocodile is obviously associated with crocodiles. Gecko Moria is associated with geckos and bats. Kuma is associated with bears, Hancock is associated with snakes, Jinbei is associated with whale sharks, and Doflamingo is associated with flamingos. This animal theme is a trend among all of the original warlords that can serve both aesthetic and developmental purposes. Mihawk's animal theme is pretty obvious. He has hawk in his name, and his epithet is Hawkeyes. What does this matter though? What does Mihawk's animal theme of the hawk have to do with the religious imagery in his character design? Well, in Christianity, the hawk is believed to be an animal totem that encourages us to develop a precise strategy before aiming for our goals. It is believed that the hawk tells us that we have a specific purpose, and when the hawk appears, we are called to focus on our desires in order to be able to turn our dreams into reality. This religious symbolism coupled with the hawk imagery adds a beautiful theme to Mihawk's character, specifically his genuinely life-changing words just after his duel with Zoro. He tells Zoro that he will await him at the top of the world, and he invites Zoro to surpass him. These words are perfectly in tune with what I described as the hawk's representation in Christianity, and that adds a beautiful thematic layer to both Mihawk's words and his character design. Outside of serving as a means of religious symbolism, Mihawk's animal theme ties into his character in other fantastic ways. For example, hawks have excellent vision, and Oda was initially going to give Mihawk the epithet clairvoyant. Oda also used Mihawk to give us a sight into the world beyond the Grand Line, and with that, one could say that Oda used Mihawk as quote-unquote binoculars that allowed the Straw Hat to taste what the Grand Line was capable of prior to even entering the terrifying sea. Not only that, hawks are solitary and migratory birds by nature, similar to how Mihawk just rides on his tiny boat on the sea, alone and isolated. I'm sure there are even more similarities between hawks and Mihawk as a character, but we don't want to be here for days. Past the animal theme and religious imagery, another reason why I say that Mihawk's design is incredibly intrinsically detailed is because of the influence taken from the vampire Dracula of the famous gothic horror novel. A lot of influence is taken from Dracula when writing Mihawk as a character, not just his character design. Dracula was the strongest vampire, Mihawk is the strongest swordsman. Both Dracula and Mihawk are very pale individuals, and they both live in big, dark, misty castles. Kuregana directly translates to "it's really dark" in English, and Kuregana Island is the island in which Mihawk resides. Oda puts immense amounts of thought when designing and fashioning his cast, and that's seen perfectly with these examples. I want to focus on the Dracula influence though, because that ties in directly with the title of this video: Suffering from Success. Now, I haven't read Dracula personally, so forgive me for my limited knowledge, but through a bit of research, I found out that the two core themes of the novel are isolation and loneliness. These two themes play a very major role in the limited character work we have for Mihawk. Through Vivrecards, we have been given some solid information on Mihawk. It's stated that he was famous ever since before the Great Age of Piracy even began, so at the time of Roger's execution, he had already made a name for himself globally. He trained relentlessly for many years, challenging more and more powerful foes until he had no more worthy challengers. He looks forward to the day a Swordmaster will emerge to surpass even his former rival, Shanks, meaning he is waiting for the day somebody stronger than Shanks himself can challenge him and entertain him once again. Mihawk is one of the few, if not the only character alive in the world of One Piece who has succeeded in achieving everything the world has to offer him. In the world of swordsmen, Mihawk stands at the top, alone and isolated. He is confident enough in himself to be able to tell Zoro that he will await him at the top of the world. This is a promise to Zoro, an oath. Hell, even the title of the chapter is Oath. Mihawk is certain that nobody can interfere with this promise, even though he lacks allies, which is something he himself has referred to as the most terrifying power in the sea. Yet he still has unwavering confidence in his own power. I truly think people heavily undermine just how powerful and practically untouchable Mihawk is portrayed to be. Even if you completely take power scaling out of the picture, the point of his character is that he is suffering from success as a swordsman. He awaits the day a swordsman emerges that surpasses his rival Shanks. He has been bored ever since Shanks lost his arm 12 years ago. Mihawk doesn't view a one-armed Shanks as a worthy challenger. Shanks was the only individual who could satisfy him back in the day, and he sacrificed his arm and in turn sacrificed his rivalry with Mihawk. Every single powerful individual we know of had a rival of some sorts, or has a rival of some sorts. Roger had Whitebeard and Garp. The Yonko have each other. The Admirals have each other, but Mihawk, he lost his only rival 12 years ago. I think it's fair to say that this loss turned him into the lonely and isolated individual who we met in chapter 50. However, since then, I believe Mihawk underwent a very subtle change in character. I think it's fair to say that Mihawk's overbearing strength and success in the world of swordsmen turned him into a very self-centered and pretty arrogant individual. This is emphasized in various points in the story. From the way he spoke to Zoro and referred to him as a frog in a well, to his magnificent quote in Marineford where he tells some Whitebeard pirates that he does not remember the faces of every insect that he crushes. He views himself as superior to all, and that isn't the greatest character trait to have. Sure, it's mesmerizing to see Mihawk talk shit and incredibly realistic when you consider the success of this man and how that could affect one's mental state. It makes me love Mihawk all the more, but what I love even more is how this characteristic of Mihawk's changed during Marineford, where he underwent a very subtle character arc. If you think back to Mihawk's interaction with Shanks back in chapter 96, his self-centeredness is incredibly clear. Mihawk refuses to draw his sword and fight Shanks. He doesn't care what Shanks' reasons for losing his arm were, and he actually sees it as a betrayal to their rivalry. This is merely my interpretation of this interaction, but if you look at it with that understanding, you'd probably come to the same conclusion too. Just look at the way they're talking. Mihawk calls his former rival a has-been. To me, this is a form of disrespect. Shanks is a man who one day could have potentially defeated Mihawk, and that was exciting to Mihawk. But now that Shanks is handicapped, Mihawk doesn't want to settle the score anymore. He feels betrayed. So why is it that when Zoro bows his head to him after the war and begs him to train him, Mihawk accepts? Zoro threw away his pride, and technically he betrayed his rivalry with Mihawk in a similar way to Shanks. Of course, Shanks' decision was permanent and Zoro's was merely temporary, but it's still the same kind of situation. The key difference is that this time, Mihawk acknowledges and understands that Zoro threw away his pride for the sake of Luffy. With Shanks, Mihawk refused to acknowledge why he would sacrifice his arm. This is proof that change has occurred within Mihawk and he has gained the gift of perspective. How did this happen? Well, in Marineford, a lot of things happened that could have stirred this change within Mihawk. Jozu intercepts his challenge to Whitebeard. Vista stalls him and prevents him from getting to Luffy. Crocodile also clashes with Mihawk. Daz Bones gets in his way, and so many other individuals continually prevent Mihawk from getting to his goal. This leads to the famous quote of Mihawk's where he acknowledges Luffy's ability to rally allies to his side, and he calls it the most terrifying power in the seas. I think this was a moment of understanding for Mihawk. He had finally come to grips with the concept of sacrifice, what it means to throw your life away for the sake of others, what it means to fight for a cause other than yourself, what it means to be selfless, what it means to sacrifice an arm. This is the moment Mihawk gained some perspective and came to understand why Shanks, quote unquote, betrayed him. And this is why Mihawk understands Zoro's act of selflessness and doesn't see it as a betrayal. This growth that Mihawk underwent in Marineford is very easy to miss due to its subtle nature and how it happens in the background of an arc with various plot threads, hundreds of characters, non-stop action, and everything else that makes Marineford Marineford. And that is what is most special about this character arc. Oda's writing for Mihawk is meticulous and careful. This great deal of effort for his character, despite his very little screen time, gets me so excited for the potential Mihawk greatness in the remainder of the series. And the fact that the character arc is subtler is pretty poetic when you consider that the change is also very subtle. It's not like Mihawk underwent some drastic change. No, he just came to terms with a very simple concept, and that changed his perspective, or gave him the gift of perspective just a little. Now he allows Perona to stay with him. I don't think he would have let Perona stay with him in his castle prior to Marineford. That is a sign of growth. Mihawk has changed, and that very same Mihawk is currently being hunted down by Marines. What has Oda got in mind for the future of the world's strongest swordsman? Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Like the video if you enjoyed, or if you're a fan of the Godhawk, subscribe for more One Piece content, and I will see you next time where we will be analysing none other than the Desert King. I've been Fiji, peace.